With me now, Hugo Lowell, senior political correspondent for The Guardian, along with Republican strategist Susan Del Percio and former Republican Congressman David Jolly, both of whom are MSNBC political analysts. Good to see all three of you, my friends. So, Hugo, you first, because there are new Washington Post profiles out there on Biden's presidency, and it reports Biden and some of his aides still believe he should have stayed in the race and have recently said he could have beaten Trump. Where is their certainty coming from? I mean, is it because he's the only one who did beat Trump in a presidential race, or is there something else to it?
I think that's mainly it. You know, on both sides of the aisle during the campaign in the wake of Biden dropping out, you know, even people like Kellyanne Conway was telling Trump, and maybe this is partly where it's coming from, Kellyanne Conway was telling Trump that now he was basically having a clear field because the only person who had beaten him previously was Joe Biden, and Trump had previously beaten a woman. So Kellyanne Conway told the former president that he had a clear lane and he was in the best position ultimately that he could imagine. And I think Joe Biden's team for a long time has also felt this way. You know, you speak to people in and around the administration and they have long said that Biden was seen as a unifier, you know, beyond all else. And he was also someone who had previously beaten Trump at his own game when Trump was perhaps the strongest, when he was the incumbent president. And so I think there was a lot of mixed feeling about Biden having to drop out, and maybe there's some buyer's remorse, especially from the Biden side.
Okay, flip side, Susan, because many Democrats hold the opposite view. They say that he stayed in the race too long. How does the Democratic Party move forward if there's still such fundamental disagreement about what went wrong?
They have to get over what went wrong and deal with what's in front of them. And that is trying to at least get better policy out of what the Republicans propose or in line with their political beliefs. 2024 is just about over. And the only thing that Democrats have to focus on now is working on their messaging. And they should know by now, talking about the past isn't going to get them there. So, and by the way, for the record, I was one who talked about the past too. I was definitely off on that messaging, but you have to go forward. And without a strong party leader nationally, it's going to come down to probably Hakeem Jeffries showing Democrats where they should put their energies.
So, David, Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, said the president has been operating on a time horizon measured in decades, while the political cycle is measured in 4 years. And he repeated something Biden has said, that many of his accomplishments will take time to really be felt. How big is the concern out there that Trump will get the credit, at least in the short term, for what Biden accomplishes? And can Democrats keep it from happening?
Yeah, look, I think the contrast in leadership might provide the answer to that. What I mean by that is Joe Biden is a sober, steady leader who is okay with policies that have second and third order effects. So we are not going to end the war in Ukraine by surrendering to Vladimir Putin. He's going to restore economic growth with a slow and steady pace, returning people to work, bringing inflation down, real wages up, investments in infrastructure. He's going to restore democracy, which is kind of a long-term game coming out of the first 4 Trump years. Donald Trump's not concerned about second and third order effects. He's concerned about right now. And so his fiscal policy will be one where he drives up debts and deficits without question, renews tax cuts. He'll try to lower interest rates. He'll create bubbles. But as long as it feels good for 4 years, Donald Trump will declare victory. And so will it be a combination of the foundation that Joe Biden leaves for Donald Trump or some quick fixes by Donald Trump? Probably both. But the difference between the two is Joe Biden was looking over a time horizon, as Jake Sullivan said, of decades. Donald Trump's going to be looking at 4 years. Give me credit right now. I don't care about who comes after me.
Yeah, you're right. Hugo, Trump and congressional Republicans, they seem to be pretty much laying the groundwork to charge members of the January 6th committee and its witnesses. I know you spoke to incoming House Judiciary Committee ranking member Jamie Raskin. And here's what he said about claims that star witness Cassidy Hutchinson was pressured and committed perjury. Take a listen.
They haven't contradicted a single thing that Cassidy Hutchinson said or any of the factual statements that we made in the report. So it's very hard to see how you build a legal case around any of that.
What is your impression of how seriously Democrats are taking the threat of charges against these members?
It's a difficult question, right? Because Republicans and Trump allies have long said, even if we don't end up pursuing these criminal cases to what would be otherwise a logical end, to sort of charges and a grand jury, if we can make the life difficult for Democrats and who served on the January 6th committee, even Republicans, people like Liz Cheney, if we can make their life difficult, if we can make the life difficult for witnesses, then that's kind of our retribution because, they put us through hell, so we're going to put them through hell. And that's been the prevailing sense. I think when, Congressman Raskin was talking about the viability of charges and how strong the evidence was, clearly there is nothing there, especially members of Congress like Liz Cheney are protected by the speech or debate clause. It basically means they cannot be questioned in any place other than Congress. So the idea that they're going to, subpoena Liz Cheney's communications, it's going to be it's basically a non-starter. It's basically unenforceable through the Justice Department. And by the way, that was the same tactic that Republicans used to stymie the January 6th committee when the shoe was on the other foot. I think there is bigger concern for people like Cassidy Hutchinson, the witnesses who testified. They're being effectively accused of perjuring themselves or misstating or distorting the truth of January 6th committee. But that's also a really high bar for a typical criminal investigation because you have to prove that sort of intent. But I think it's very likely that Republicans will try and push this ball, if only to make life difficult for the January 6th witnesses.
But my question to you, Susan, is beyond what your take is, how legitimate is this threat against the committee members? I mean, how could Kash Patel, if confirmed as head of the FBI and subsequently Pam Bondi confirmed as Attorney General, how would they play into Trump's threats?
Well, I don't think they will. I think what the Republicans are probably going to do is open up congressional investigations and drag all of these people through the process again, try to catch them up under oath. I don't think bringing charges is number one. I think having those hearings and frankly creating typical Trump style, a lot of smoke and mirrors to keep people distracted. But their findings, again, they can refer charges to DOJ, but they can't really do anything. So I think this is all about congressional hearings more so than when it comes to DOJ pressing charges.
Okay. Last question to you, David, because Trump has repeatedly said a day one priority, pardoning January 6th rioters. Rolling Stone asked the transition team if those pardons could include those that have been imprisoned on seditious conspiracy charges. We're talking like the leaders of the Oath Keepers or Proud Boys. The Trump team didn't rule it out, saying it would be handled on a case-by-case basis. Quote, for those who were denied due process and unfairly targeted by the justice system. What happens when Trump decides these serious offenders were unfairly targeted?
Well, then Trump needs to be held accountable. Some of them might make sympathetic cases for a pardon, the grandmother who walked through the Capitol, fine, but some of these are really bad people, including one who just got caught trying to sign up with the Russians to fight Ukraine against the interests of the United States. That's somebody that he might also pardon. I'm very curious, Alex, on day one, starting with the inauguration speech. His first inauguration speech, we saw American carnage. It surprised a lot of people, the tone. I think one of the things Donald Trump wants to do this term, starting on day one, is rewrite history. We're going to see it on COVID, having RFK Jr. there. We're going to see it on Russia, having Tulsi Gabbard there. We're going to see it with a lot of the prosecutions by having Kash Patel there, should these people get confirmed. But I think we're also going to see a retelling of January 6th. And the question is, does that start with his inauguration speech? Or is it something that happens by way of pardons? Or is it a prosecution, an attempted prosecution of Liz Cheney? I do think Donald Trump wants to rewrite history. And to do that, he's going to force upon the American people a narrative that largely is untrue, but that he hopes with conservative media's influence he can win out with.
Stunning commentary, to which I say, buckle up, everybody, effective January 20. Thank you very much. Good to see all three of you.